everybody. Thanks for joining me here today. This is Nicole with Topaz, and I'm happy to welcome back Mr. Blake Rudis. Hey, Blake.
Thank you for having me here today yet again. It's always great to be back here and on this platform where we can all learn and do what we love to do together. That's awesome. So this presentation is called the Start to the Art because I'm going to be talking about how a photo begins and how you go from something like this, which is slightly underexposed in one area and not really quite exposed for where we want it for our background, to get that image the way we want it to look technically, and then moving into the artistic realm. Now, just like any historic war, there is always a turning point in the artistic approach to creating your photographs. So that's what I'm here to focus on today, is talking about how to edit that image and set that image up for the artistic effects so that as you go through this process, you can make a technically sound photograph and then move from the technically sound photograph at that turning point right into the artistic point at which that image can turn. Now, it's really important to separate the two, in my humble opinion. I don't start my images out artistically. I have an idea in mind of what I want to do with that photograph, that's a given, but I don't necessarily try to focus too much attention on the artistic side of things until I get it technically correct first. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start out in Adobe Camera Raw. Just so you know, on the front side, the programs I'll be covering in this are going to be Adobe Camera Raw, Topaz Clarity, Topaz Adjust, Topaz Impression, Topaz Texture Effects, and then we'll even do a little bit of stuff in Photoshop, but not too Photoshop intense today. All right, so here is my photo that I'm opening up here. This is the baseline image. Actually, this last weekend I rented a Sony a7R II and the Canon 5DS. They're like the megapixel monsters that are on the scene these days, and they're both phenomenal cameras. And I put them head to head in a grudge match, fight to the death. Actually, I didn't have them fight to the death because I don't have enough insurance to cover either of those cameras. But I liked what I got out of the Sony a7R II, and that's this image right here. This is a 42 megapixel photograph. That's not the impressive part. The impressive part is that it has a lot of dynamic range in it. And what that means for you, newer cameras with newer sensors have better dynamic range in those sensors as they come out. That allows you to take images to a different level than you normally would be able to by increasing the exposure from exposures that aren't quite there. So I've been really playing with the a7R II and a lot of these newer cameras these days, and just how far you can take one RAW file is the experiments that I'm doing these days, trying to actually get away from the whole tone mapping aspect. So with this photograph here, we are going to go into Adobe Camera Raw at first, and in Adobe Camera Raw we're going to just get this exposure kind of the way we want it to be set up for future success, essentially. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to just increase the exposure a little bit here, brighten up the exposure all around, and then go into the individual settings like the shadows and the highlights individually so that I can pull and extract essentially the information that I need from this file. So if you look at the sky, those are our highlight tones. So if I drop the highlights down, I can start to bring all of the area in the back of the image, the sky, forward towards us and make it pop out a little bit more by dropping those highlights and then increasing these shadows here. That will bring the whole image basically to a stable point. And what I'm doing here is, if you look at the before, so here's the before. We've got an underexposed foreground and a slightly overexposed background. If we look at the after, we've got more of a properly exposed foreground with a slightly properly exposed background. And this is essentially the tone mapping or HDR process happening right in front of you in Adobe Camera Raw without the use of multiple files. So a lot of people say, well, I didn't HDR it because I didn't tone map it. Well, essentially, this is HDR here. You're heightening the dynamic range in the photo that's there. You're exploiting the dynamic range that's already existent in that file. So yes, this is a form of tone mapping to an extent. And then anytime I drop the highlights and increase the shadows like that, it's always a good idea to come in here in the contrast and just bump that contrast up a little bit, because as you release those shadows essentially and open them up, you tend to get some flat looking image there. So to increase the depth, you can just come back into the contrast here and increase the contrast a little bit to get more depth in the photo. And really all I'm doing here is setting myself up for future success in something like Topaz Clarity, which Clarity is going to do a lot more to bring this out, and Adjust is also going to do some more to bring this out too. One thing that I will do here is I will zoom into an area of high contrast to low contrast, which would be anywhere where these trees meet that background, okay? So if I move into those areas of high contrast to low contrast, you'll see that you might have some chromatic aberration. One thing that I was actually really impressed with the A7R2 and the 16 to 35 millimeter lens, the Zeiss lens, is that chromatic aberrations were almost non-existent, and I really don't see them here. But I always have to say, okay, jump into your lens correction settings and go to color, and just in case, make sure you remove any chromatic aberrations. And chromatic aberrations are the little cyan and magenta fringing that you get on areas of high contrast to low contrast. This image doesn't necessarily have any, but I want you to know that that's one step that you might want to take. In the PDF that you're going to see in this documentation for this webinar, I also highlight that there. So I'm going to go ahead and open this image now because I'm pretty much done at this point. Now I'm going to move into Topaz Clarity and really start to bring this image out a little bit more and exaggerate some stuff that's happening in that sky back there. So I'm going to duplicate this image by pressing Command or Control J, and then go into Filter, Topaz Labs, and go to Clarity. Now, one of the things about Clarity for me, this is, of all of the plugins and programs that Topaz created, I believe that Clarity is probably my favorite technical editing program. And you'll often hear me talk about the technical side of things and the artistic side of things. Now, from a technical standpoint, I can do a lot with my photographs in Clarity because I can adjust tone and color. This program will not do any outlandish impression stuff that Impression does on the artistic side. That's not what it's designed for. This program is specifically designed to increase your tone and your color and give you a lot more room to experiment with your photographs on the tone and color side, which I find really impressive. You have a lot that you can work with here. So let's go ahead and go into this. If you're in Topaz Clarity, there are a few presets that you can use over here. I tend to just close the presets off so that I can see my image better and just go ahead and fit this into the screen so that I can see more of my photograph and just get rid of the presets, because for me, if I'm going to be technically editing a photograph, a preset is not going to help me, because a preset works on a very specific dynamic range of a very specific photo that preset was created for. So in looking at this photograph, I'm going to hit the histogram. Always go up to the histogram, because the histogram is going to tell you a lot of stuff as you edit this image. So the first thing I'm going to do as I'm looking at the histogram is edit my contrast. Your micro contrast is going to be your areas of small contrast, and then moving into your low contrast, slightly larger areas of contrast, and then medium, and then high contrast being very large groups of contrast. It's kind of like in Topaz Detail where they have the small details, the medium details, and the large details. It's kind of like that. Also, if you've ever used the clarity slider in something like Camera Raw or Lightroom, that's very much what Clarity is, but on a much more targeted scale. We'll say that. So I'm going to increase the micro contrast up quite a bit here. You see, as I increase that micro contrast, we're seeing a lot more of the sky kind of pull forward like I wanted to. The sky was very dramatic this morning. It was very purple. It was very vibrant. It was gorgeous, and it really is something that you couldn't capture in one frame. I did HDR, I did take a bracketed series of exposures for this, but as I edit this, there's a couple things I keep in mind. On the technical side of things, I always edit to a technical standpoint in order to make that image look like what I saw. So that's the technical aspect. Try to get that as closely related to what I saw, and then I let myself just have a heyday with my plugins and my programs there. So I'm going to increase that micro contrast. I'll start increasing this low contrast too. And really, right now, I'm not too worried about what's happening in my histogram. I'm more just concerned about the overall look and feel of the image I'm getting. You'll see what I do with the histogram in a second here. So I'll increase the medium contrast and then even the high contrast quite a bit here. And we can go a little bit higher with this. So now what I mean by looking at the histogram, you can see that in the before, we have that very muddy kind of 50% gray, drab, boring looking, low contrast image. Well, now we have a much more contrasty photo. We've increased the contrast so much that there is pure black and pure white just screaming off the page. This is where the tone level comes in. If you move this to the left, it's going to move your histogram further to the left, making black areas much more black. If you move it to the right until you don't see anything else touching the side there, so I'll move this to the right until those black areas start to get recovered. Okay, and as those black areas start to get recovered, you can see that the histogram pushes itself with more of the black area pushing more towards the midtones, and that's how we get that well-rounded looking photograph. We also have our midtones adjustment here. We can grab our midtones, we can move it to the left and to the right, making our midtones themselves darker or lighter. One thing that I've noticed here is that my clouds are blowing out. So I'll take that white level and I'll decrease that white level quite a bit. Okay, so looking at that histogram, my whites are pushing really far over here. Those white areas that are pushing really far on this edge of the histogram are these clouds here. Notice as I push this to the left, our whites start to become more of less of a blowout and more of a natural looking white that we see there. So let me go ahead and just knock this low contrast down a slight bit and even the medium contrast a bit too, and you'll see that that's going to help my white areas and resurrect those areas. The next thing I want to talk about in clarity is going to be the hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments. These are very powerful here in Topaz Clarity because you have the ability to not only modify tone but now modify color on many different levels. You can modify color on its saturation, meaning how much saturation of, say, the color orange exists in this photo or the color blue exists in this photo. You can do that based on the luminance of those colors or the tone of that color. So how light is blue and how dark is blue. And you can really create a dramatic feel with these. On the same side, you can go into the hue and say, okay, well, I want blue to be more of a purplish color, or I want blue to be more of a cyan color. So you have a lot of potential here to modify the colors to make them look like what you saw. So one of my suggestions is to go into the hue saturation or the saturation section first. So here I'm going to increase my orange saturation just to find out where the color orange might exist in this photo. It's really helpful on the saturation side because I can see saturation blowing out really easily, more so than I can luminance. And the orange, the only place I see orange is right down here in this photo, right down here in this lower portion. But if I increase the purple amount, you can start to see how the saturation of the purple exists on those edges of the clouds, and then magenta being the lower areas of the clouds, and there's quite a bit of blue in this. So I'm going to go ahead and decrease those saturations just to know what kind of colors I'm working with here. I don't have a whole lot of yellow. I do have quite a bit of red, not a whole lot of orange. Aqua, pretty much non-existent. This just lets me know, okay, Blake, these are the colors that you have to work with. Now start modifying them accordingly. So with the blue, if I wanted the blue to have more of this magenta look to it, like the clouds did that morning, I could just push the blue over in the hue adjustment. That's basically taking the color blue and rotating it around the color wheel to get it closer to the color red. That's all we're doing here. Do the same thing here, modify the purple, maybe make the purple a little bit more on the magenta side to really push this portion of the cloud out. I'm just trying to make the clouds a little bit more pronounced and a little bit more defined here. And go through these individually and see, I like that orange to have slightly more yellow in it, so if I push that more toward the green side, that little sliver of orange turns yellow, and I like that. It's just a nice, brief moment where you just kind of laughs off the rest of the image and say, oh, there's a little hint of orange there, I like that. So then we can go into our saturation of our individual colors and amplify the saturation accordingly, make that blue a little bit more saturated, and it's okay to saturate things. But look at our histogram as we move the color blue down to the left. Notice how blue is not touching the side of our image. So as we move this to the left, our blues start to turn gray. And as we move it to the right, our blues start to get more luminance to them. They start to get more of a value to them. That's all we're doing here. We're adding more blue to the color blue. And if we move it this far, it's just like a highlight blowout. So oversaturation is just like overtoning something. You can overtone it, and you can oversaturate it very easily. And I'll just play with these just a little bit more. I'm really, when I come in here, this is one of those things that this is more of the intrinsical emotional side of things that comes out. Your mood will dictate the colors and the directions that you go with those colors. So be careful. Don't edit when you're really mad at your spouse, okay? Or your images will be really mean. So then in the luminance, I can take the color blue and I can make that blue overall brighter or add more white to it, or I can bring it down and add more black. This hue, saturation, and luminance palette is very much like an artist palette that they would have in front of their hand. Okay, this is where if I wanted more white in my blues to lighten them up, I move this to the right. If I want them darker, I move it to the left to make more drama in the color blue. This is part of the artistic portion of the editing, but still on the technical side because we're getting our color technically sound. Now I'm going to jump into the masks because if you look at the original, here's the original. I like the barn having that whitish sort of look to it, but notice what happens. In that whitish color, that barn is not white, that barn is not gray. That barn is comprised of different colors that we've modified and edited. So I'm going to go into the masks of this individual area. See, if you notice in clarity, you have masks for your clarity, and down here you have masks for your individual areas. So I'm going to go and hide something here. So I want to hide this barn, and I'm going to make my brush size slightly large, and then the hardness slightly soft, a little bit harder than what it is, and maybe just bring the brush size down just a slight bit more. I've got edge aware selected. So what edge aware is going to do is it's going to make sure that as I'm modifying this barn here, it's not going to select anything on the outside of that barn. I say that lightly because sometimes you might get a little bit of stuff on the outside of that barn and it's okay. But this is setting me up for a good overall image that I can work with. I don't want the ground to be purple because the sky was purple. The ground was definitely had some browns and some different color variations that were in the sky. One of the things that I really like here, and I actually just started experimenting with this today, is this smart feather that's in Topaz Clarity. So in this smart feather, look up here at our mask, okay? So look in this area where our mask is. With the smart feather, you can actually increase the radius of your mask, and you can increase the radius of how aware it is of those edges as you increase that mask. So look at the mask and look at how it's naturally starting to grab more of the vines now, or not vines, sorry, more of the trees. They look like vines kind of spreading out there, or veins. But as I increase this feather radius, it's starting to select things outside of it to make this more of a natural selection. So as I move that feather aware up, you can see that it starts to just briefly kind of go out and grab those areas and make more of a gradation of a mask. Now this is a very harsh mask. If we move all this down, this is a very harsh mask. It's got harsh edges on it. But as we increase the feather awareness, this is basically spreading out that mask. And as we increase that feather radius, it's increasing the spread of this mask, but at the same time, it's got a nice graduated release on it, so it's spreading out naturally. Now, a lot of times you'll see if someone masks something poorly, you'll see the actual line work of where they made that mask, and this helps you avoid that. So you can increase or decrease that mask strength. So you can see here, our barn now is pretty much pure black, meaning our barn has nothing edited to it, but that mask is slowly and gradually spreading out towards the rest of it. And I believe the masking features here in Clarity are much better than in some of the other Topaz products like Topaz Adjust and some of the other ones. So I really wanted to touch on that because a lot of people don't see me masking in the Topaz products too much, and I'll be honest with you, part of it had to do with the fact that I just hadn't experimented too much with it. I know it sounds really bad, but that's the truth. Okay, so now I've experimented with it more, I can teach more on it. I was doing what I was comfortable with and not getting outside of my comfort zone. It's a lesson all of us can learn. Break out of your comfort zone because great things will happen when you do that. And then I'll just go ahead and press OK because at this point I'm very technically happy with the image that I've created so far. I do want to do a little bit more in Topaz Adjust, but for the most part I think we've come a long way from where we were. So here's where we were in the beginning, and then here is where we are now. This was after Adobe Camera Raw, and this is after a little bit of Clarity. Now some of those things you could do in Camera Raw with the hue saturation adjustments that you saw there. That could very well have been done in Adobe Camera Raw, but the benefit that Topaz Clarity has over Camera Raw or Lightroom is the ability to mask in the hue saturation adjustment section. So if you go into Lightroom, if you go into Adobe Camera Raw and you go into the hue saturation adjustment area and you make all these modifications to your color, guess what? You don't have the ability to mask, but you do in Topaz Clarity. So that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to touch on that product, because really helps you when you get out of Adobe Camera Raw to get those basic settings, or Lightroom to get those basic settings and basic adjustments, and you start moving into that more technical approach. So we're going to make one more technical adjustment here. I'm going to duplicate that by pressing Command or Control J. I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and go to Adjust. Now, one of the things about Adjust is I started to get away from Topaz Adjust. Adjust was the very first product I bought in 2008, I believe it was, maybe 2007. And if Topaz saw the first photo that I processed with Adjust, you probably never would have had me on a webinar. So you can get really crazy with Topaz Adjust and make some really bad movements with Adjust. So I want to do that. I want to make some bad adjustments with Topaz Adjust here and show you that you can still recover from that if you make another layer like I did. So I'm going to make this pretty harsh. So I'm going to make my regions a little bit high, and I'm going to make my exposure pretty high. Now, this is one of those theories that I often talk about, and this is the broken arm theory. You might say, well, Blake, it was perfectly fine before you brought it into Adjust, and then I open up Adjust and I do something like this, and you're like, okay, this is really bad. Where is he going with this? The idea behind this is that even in the worst adjusted image like this, like what you see in Topaz Adjust here, with this adaptive exposure that I've done here, even with this bad thing that's happened, we can make it better. And the broken arm analogy is this. If maybe you have a fracture in your arm and you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, in order to make this arm better, we could splint it, but then it might not grow back correctly. In order to do that, we're going to have to break the arm. We're going to have to break it so that it can heal correctly. And sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes in order to get the adjustment that you want, you have to take it to an extreme level and then bring it back to where you want it to be on your image. So that's what I'm doing here. Topaz Adjust can create some really interesting effects if we go into some of these pop grunge and HDR looking effects. And they can be great, but they can also be a little too much. They oftentimes over-exaggerate what it is that we're trying to do. And here I am over-exaggerating what I'm trying to do here. So I'm going to increase this contrast here, increase these regions, and you'll notice that there's quite a bit of halos around here. Our clouds look really dramatic, and that's okay. I'm actually okay with that. Typically what I do with Adjust here is use Adjust just like this. I use it to over-exaggerate the information that is in my image so that I can pull something from it later. This is also the good bad thing, that even in some of the worst things that happen in your life, you can find something good in it. Even in the worst photo edit that you do, you can find something good in it. So I don't like what's happening to the barn. I don't like what's happening to my grass and my foliage here, but I really do enjoy what's happening to my clouds, but not to this extent. But if I bring this down, then I don't quite get the extent that I like up here. So I'll bring this up and I'll go back into Photoshop. And this is where one of my favorite things comes in. It's called Blend If. So if I double click anywhere next to where it says Layer 1 Copy, I'll double click right here. You get these Blend If principles that pop up. If you move this to the right down here, this is basically saying protect any of the underlying layers, so any of these layers, from what's going on this layer. So if I move this over to the right, you can start to see how things start to slowly adapt into the image, right? So if I move this over here, the image just starts to disappear. And as I move it to the left, it starts to come back. And it does it really harsh. It's got these harsh edges on it. But if I press Alt or Option here, I can split this. And that feathers it, just like we talked about the feathering mask, okay? And the same thing here. So we've got this halo around these trees. Well, to avoid that halo around these trees, let's just drop this until those halos around the trees start to disappear, and then we'll Alt split this and move it over. So now we've got the best of what we wanted out of Topaz Adjust without getting too much of the bad. Now, in the foreground of the barn, I don't really care too much for what's happening in the foreground of the barn, nor do I care for what's happening in the ground, and that's fine. I can just create a mask here and then use my brush tool and not have a funky brush here. Use the brush tool, make it a little bit smaller, and just paint with black. So black conceals and white reveals. That's the little trick that you can use there. So I'll just paint with black to push all that nasty stuff away that I didn't like Topaz Adjust doing. But I get the nice, funky looking sky that Topaz Adjust had. And the sky did look a lot better than what the exposure gives it to be. And at this point, this is where I would say that this is the first turning point in the war of the art that we have here, okay? And what I mean by that is this could be my technically great photograph or good photograph. I wouldn't necessarily call it great. It's not like I would print it and put it in a gallery, but this could be a good photograph. Okay, so this is my technically good photograph. Before I even move into my artistic realm of anything, this is what I would call, okay, Blake, good job, you got it technically good. Now you are free to move into the artistic realm. I would even go so far right now as to go to File, Save As, and save this as a TIFF so that this is saved as a 16-bit TIFF that's got all this data and all this information in it. So now I'm free to move on. I've saved my technically good photograph, so as I do any artistic processes on it, I don't lose any of that information, and I've got two variations of the same image. So at this point, I'm going to move more into the artistic element of things, and I want to do that by using Topaz Impression. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to press Control, Shift, Alt, and E, and that is the hotkey to make a stamp. Basically what that is, it's like a carbon copy. Like you took all of these layers, put them on top of each other, ran them through a photocopier, and then put it right on top of the rest of it. So if I edit anything down here, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to see it because this is the presiding layer. Even all of these blend options and masks don't exist on this layer because it's a carbon copy of everything that's happened underneath it. And that's one of the things that I like to do when I'm pressing forward with another application. Some people like to use smart objects. I prefer to use these what they call stamp layers or stamped visible layers. I think I have a little bit more control than a smart object. So I'm going to go into Filter and go to Topaz Labs and go to Impression. So before I do that, let me see something real quick here. One of the things that I do want to discuss here before this is a technique that some people use to make an image sort of glow. Okay, so before I jump into Impression, I want to show you this because this is what I'm going to be doing in Topaz Impression. So one of the things that you can make an image just kind of glow a little bit, not Topaz glow, but glow a little bit, is to go to Filter, go to Blur, and go to Gaussian Blur. And I'm going to Gaussian blur this quite a bit to like 40.1. You'll understand how this is coming all into play in a second here. You're like, yeah, Blake, you got this really blurred photo. But if I go to something like Soft Light, this now gives my image this kind of ethereal glow, this very pretty glow. We can take that same concept and run it in Impression, and that's what I want to do here. I took a little detour because I wanted to show you where this technique comes from. So we'll go to Filter, Topaz Labs. Let me go to Impression. Okay, there we go. So in Impression, I'm going to go to the Painting section, and in the Painting section, there's one called Monet 2. So in Painting, scroll down until you get to Monet 2. It might even be in the Featured section. I think it's actually in the Featured section. It's in the Featured section, right here in the front. It's called Monet 2. So I like this Monet 2, and the reason why I like this is because it's going to give me that same type of blurring effect that we had before. So here's our before, here's our after, and we get this kind of blurred effect with this Monet 2. Now what I want you to do if you do something like this is to turn this to soft light. So we turn this to soft light, and now we see that same type of glow, but with this artistic type of look. So let's go into the settings, and here, when you've got this set to soft light and you adjust these settings, you can make this look and feel like a glow that you've never had before. So I guess it's kind of like a Topaz glow. It's more of a radiance type of thing. If we adjust the spill, it's going to be about the size of where this paint kind of goes. I'm going to adjust the smudge. The smudge is going to be that blurring effect like we had with that Gaussian blur. So here's the before, here's the after. And that paint opacity, we can add more of that paint opacity, make it a little bit thicker. We can add more paint volume, again, thickening this stuff up, making those brush strokes a little bit thicker to make that sky look a little bit more wild. This is where the artistic stuff really starts to come into play. So another thing here is as we do this, we're getting more saturation along the way with it. And that can be to your detriment sometimes. I like it with the look of this image, with where we're going to be going with this photograph. But if you don't, with your style that you're working on, take this overall saturation here and drop this down. So basically what the soft light adjustment does, it's very impressive because soft light, it's in Photoshop, it's in just about every plugin and program out there, but soft light is this way that the software calculates what's happening with your photo. It basically says anything that's 50% gray, make no change. Anything that's more white, make it whiter but never get pure white. And anything that's black, make it blacker but never get pure black. So it's a way to add increased contrast to a photograph with this overlay type of look and feel. That's why we're getting the look that we're getting right now. So I like what we've got here. This looks pretty good to me. I'll just go ahead and press OK. So now we've got this on our stamped layer up top here. We're still going to need a mask because I don't like that it's doing this to my ground. So I'll just go ahead and make a mask on here and use my brush tool and just brush in this area down here and get rid of all that stuff. So now the foreground still looks realistic, but we have this really cool kind of looking sky. You know, you don't really see that often. It's kind of neat. And this could be another stopping point. This could be another turning point where you say, okay, I'm done. I like what's going on here. I'm done. But I'm going to take it to another level because I really like what Topaz has done with texture effects. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and go to Control, Shift, Alt, and E and make another stamp so that I'm working on a stamped layer with the texture effects. Texture effects in and of itself can be a technical working program where you get things technically looking great, or it could be a very artistic program where you make things artistically sound. And I'm not a big preset fan. If you've ever seen any of my training or any of the last 20 webinars, you know that I don't use presets a lot. Right? I don't really care for them. But what Topaz has done in this program is absolutely incredible. I love this 1950s print look. I mean, this right here could be an artistic image where I'm done. You know, but to me, the set it and forget it and be done is not enough. I can't just do that. I can't leave it at that. I'm going to go further. But just take a look at this stuff. I mean, some of these settings that are already built in here are very nice. And one of the reasons why is because it's working on two different levels. It's working on a technical level and it's working on an artistic level. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a whole new preset, and I'm going to just show you how I go through this whole thought process as I create my image. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make a basic adjustment. And in this basic adjustment, I'm going to do some things to set me up, because one of the things that texture really likes, if you've never used textures thrive on areas of white. So if you increase the brightness, it'll give you more of a blank canvas for your texture to work off of. I'm going to increase my shadows again to increase the overall contrast in this photo. So if you notice, what I'm doing here is I'm increasing that contrast again, like you saw me do in Adobe Camera Raw. So as I build up artistically, I'm building up artistically on almost a blank canvas, but with a very stylized look. I will come back to this more than likely in a second here, because this clarity, this can do some really cool things, but I'm not sure what I want to do with this yet. So I'm going to leave this at 0 for now and come back to that later. The next adjustment I'm going to do is a texture adjustment. So I'll just add another adjustment right here, go to texture. And in the textures here, there's one that I really do like in the color wash section, especially for this one. In the color wash section, there's like this purplish magenta looking one here. I like this. But I'm going to look at the size of those textures to see if I want that texture to be a little bit bigger. I don't like that because of this little dot that I'm seeing there. That's not a problem, though. If I make it small, I'll dig that. That works for me. The opacity of that texture, how much of that texture is actually coming through. Sometimes it's good to just increase this opacity all the way when you're working with these textures, just so you know what this texture actually looks like. Okay, so you can click any of these textures all day long, but if you don't know what it actually looks like, it's very hard to make a decision on what you want it to do with your photograph. So I suggest bringing that opacity all the way up just to see what the texture is. It might have some aspects of that texture that you don't even like. So bring that opacity up, and then maybe just bring that down a little bit as you edit your image here. Another thing here, you bring the opacity up, you bring the detail up, you can see all the detail that's coming out in that texture. If you don't know what this detail slider is doing, then I wouldn't use it unless you know. So now you know. Bring the opacity up, look at the saturation. What colors come through when I bring that saturation up? What colors come through when I bring this color strength up? What colors come through when I change the hue? These are all things that you need to know in the artistic process. Don't just come in here and start fumbling with sliders. Make educated decisions on what it is that you're doing. So I'm going to move this detail down just a slight bit, and then move this opacity down a little bit too, so that it's not quite coming through that strong. One thing I did like with the color strength is how this got like a reddish tone to it, so I'll bring that up. And let me see, that looks about good for me right now at this point. I'll be good there. Another thing I want to add is a dust and scratches layer. And these dust and scratches layers are pretty interesting. I really do like these additions here, and I'll actually, if I have time, I'll show you one of the things that I do with dust and scratches outside of the Topaz plugins. So hopefully I can get through that so I have enough time here. I do like this one right here. This one gives me like this old aged washed looking photograph. but it's a little bit too much. If we bring the opacity all the way up, it's going to show you what's happening here. The reason why you can't see the black, you're like, why is the black not there? That's because these dust and scratches have a built-in screen effect applied to them. Basically, what screen does, it drops out everything that is dark in that image and allows anything that's a whiter version of the pixel underneath it to show through. That's why you're seeing what you're seeing here. So I'll just drop that opacity a slight bit and just make that come through just a very slight bit. Okay, so drop that down a little bit, and then we'll look at the color strength. I don't think there should be too much color in here. There shouldn't be any color in here because it's there's a slight bit of color that's coming along the lines. So we'll bring that up too because it's got a nice reddish tone to it. And then I'll just drop that opacity back down again. And I like what's going on there. So then the next thing I'm going to do is I will go into add another adjustment, and I'm going to add a border to this. And the border that I'm going to add is this one. And as I add this border, look at the border. It's black. If we invert that border will then have more of a whitish tone to it. But we have to change the blending option here. Just like I said before, if you change it to screen, anything that's black will just dodge right on out. And that's what we want there. If we set this to normal and we invert it, that looks good because I had this set to multiply at the start. But if we select this one and we want that border to be a white border rather than a black border, the difference is, why a white border and a black border? Well, a black border is going to force us into the image. It's kind of like a vignette. It's going to say, okay, I am putting a black border on this. You cannot see outside of me because I am black. I'm a higher contrast. When we change this to a white border, it's more of like this ethereal kind of shift where you're moving out of the photograph. You're transitioning from into the photograph, out of the photograph, and it's got a light, airy delicateness to it. That's the difference between a white border and a black border, a white vignette and a black vignette. So keep that in mind as you're making these adjustments. So then the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add a color overlay. So let me go here to this color overlay, and I want to select a brownish sort of color because I like what happens when you add these brown types of colors on top of your images to kind of have this sepia look. And I'll change that to color so that actually more of that color comes through. If you increase that opacity, you can see we now have a very sepia looking image. And I'll just drop that opacity so that that starts to come through. And then the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add another basic adjustments layer here because I like what happened in the basic adjustments before, and I'll probably go back to those. But one of the things I want to do is bring those shadows back. So if I add a basic adjustments now, I'm basically making this sandwich of this image. And if I bring the shadows back, I can start to get these edges back on my image. And that's really all I wanted to do with this one basic adjustment. So, but keep that in mind. You can go back through your images and back through your adjustments here and go maybe into the clarity section here and boost up the clarity now on this sandwich that you're building here because this is happening underneath all these other objects. And then now we have this more artistic looking image. And there's a lot of things that you can do with texture effects here, especially with the community that's now being built on this and the background of this where you can upload your own textures to it. You can download other people's textures from it and start using other people's textures and stuff that people have already done. It's really, it's kind of paving the way for a community sharing outside of Facebook, but right here in Topaz products, it's pretty neat. I do like that. And if you needed to, you have your masking section down here, but I'm going to go ahead and press OK. So just like you saw me do before with the blend if options, I can do the same thing with this one. So if I double click inside of here, I can do blend if options here so that if I move this over, I'm protecting certain areas in this image underneath this layer that I've done. So I can press Alt or Option here to split this down and just blend in those areas so that it's not like a full-on artistic effect that you have from all of those textures that I've added. It's just a nice, subtle form. Now you can see back here I've kind of lost all my whites. If I press Alt or Option and just split this from here, you'll start to see those whites start to come back around the edge there. And if you like that, go for that. This is where you get to be a little bit more finite in the direction that you choose. Another thing here is if we go ahead and change this now to like something like put a gradient map on here, a black and white gradient map. We now have a black and white sort of look to our photograph. Drop this opacity down a little bit. These are all artistic decisions that start to come in as you build this artistic piece. So just because an image starts like this doesn't mean you can't get to something like this. Now, is this going to cater to all the masses? No. You might even be sitting here saying, I can't believe Blake made some of these decisions. But these are artistic decisions, and every artist is going to make a different decision. All right, so keep that in mind as you process your photographs. You're not stuck with just the technical side. You can transition into that artistic side. And because of the way you can build things now, you can be very selective. You can be actually very liberal about what you do. I remember when I was a kid growing up in the darkroom, I was always one of the kid that probably everyone hated in high school, especially in the art classes, because I would always finish things really fast because I was just so passionate about it, I guess, if you want to call it that. So my photography professor, bless her, it was her first year as a photography professor, and she said, she was trying to create these assignments for us, and I kept breezing through them too fast. So one of the things she did is she gave me a piece of photographic paper that had pits and pockets in it. And it was basically a photographic piece of paper that you could print your image onto and then paint on it with these oil pastels. So I created this image that I wanted to paint on, and it took me about, I don't know, 3 hours to develop it from start to finish. Then I had to wait a whole day in order to start using the pastels because you didn't want the oil and the water to mix, so you wanted the whole print to be dry. What's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is it took me almost 48 hours to experiment with the photograph artistically. A couple, I'd say 15 years ago or so, actually it was longer than that, 16 years ago. It took me that long to experiment with the photograph. And here I am, I just showed you in 45 minutes how you can experiment with your photographs to be more artistic. And I didn't have to lose 48 hours in that process to start to see who I was as an artist. So if you're in this transition period of your artistic career, your photography career, where you're not sure if you should jump on board with this artistic thing, you've been playing with your photos for a while, you kind of like what's going on, but you're not sure, dive into some of these really artistic versions of Topaz products like impression and texture effects. These things can really set your work over the edge and make you an overall happier artist photographer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Blake. This has been so informative, and we have a ton of feedback saying that many of our users have learned a lot in this session. So thank you for covering all of that.
That's awesome. I appreciate that.
If you want to follow Blake, you can do so at everydayhdr.com. If you have any questions, you can contact us at webinars@topazlabs.com, and keep an eye out for upcoming sessions next year. We are done with our Topaz webinar series for 2015, so thank you, Blake, for ending it in a nice manner. Congratulations again to Jerry. We'll be getting in touch with you through the email address that you registered with. And with that, have a fantastic holiday season, everybody, and we will be talking to you soon. Bye, Blake.
Bye. Thank you very much.